I'm Richard Dodd, and you're listening to the Ecology Academy podcast. This is a show where we get to talk and learn about all things ecological, including interviews with top ecologists, both employers and employees, those working with ecologists, and also aspiring and inspiring career-seeking individuals setting out to make a difference. The show aims to provide you with insights, advice, and inspiration to help you succeed and excel as an effective ecologist and to make a real difference to our natural environment. Hi there, and welcome to another episode of the Ecology Academy podcast. Now, on today's episode, I have none other than Dr. Nick White, who's the Principal Advisor for Net Gain at Natural England. Now, Nick works across government, both at the national and local level, and he works with developers, NGOs, and academia, and mainly to advance policy, practice, and standards around net gain, which includes biodiversity net gain, natural capital, and environmental net gain. Now, the current focus of Nick's work is on biodiversity net gain legislation, the Biodiversity Metric and Biodiversity Net Gain standards and guidance, as well as working on the evolving approach to marine net gain. Now, as a non-ecologist, Nick is interested in how biodiversity and the natural environment can contribute towards wider social and economic benefits, and has a strong interest in green infrastructure, especially in relation to urban areas and its ability to enhance wider or grey infrastructure resilience. Nick enjoys engaging with different sectors and seeking opportunities to help secure the delivery of shared outcomes, and has previously worked in the health, cultural and charitable sectors. And on today's episode, we are going to go deep and look at biodiversity net gain legislation, but the biodiversity metric itself, the biodiversity standards and guidance, and we may, if we get time, to talk about marine net gain. So, without further ado, let's get into the episode. So, welcome, Nick, to the Ecology Academy podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Richard.
It's not a problem at all. It's I'm really interested to hear about not only your work within Natural England, but also, I suppose, sort of actionable items from biodiversity net gain and the metric tool itself. If you don't mind, we'll kick off straight away.
Yeah, sure. Okay,
so you kind of sent across to me a few ideas for discussion, and one of those areas I'd like to pick up on straight away is about, I suppose, the skill set of an ecologist. Now, we're very used to undertaking ecological appraisals for land, for developers and the planning process there. So, with the use of biodiversity net gain and the metric tool, what different sort of skill sets do you think ecologists need to be aware of and sort of train themselves on going forward?
I think there are particular areas that ecologists need to be kind of aware of and thinking about in terms of kind of their future training and development. So biodiversity net gain is obviously a habitats-based approach as well. So kind of some ecologists are particularly kind of specialised in kind of species work, often because that's historically been where a lot of the work has been around protected species and the licensing requirements around that. So this requires the ability to kind of identify habitats, also have familiar with the UK HAB classification system as well. So that's relatively new within the kind of field of ecology. Is a kind of different to phase one. There is a translation available between the two, but gaining familiarity with the UK HAB system, which is it's not the sole system within that game, but it's quite a significant component of it. Similarly, with the use of the kind of metric, it comes with its own kind of condition assessment methodologies as well. And whereas some of those are drawn from kind of existing practice, so for example, some of the woodland assessments, people have been used to sort of using the kind of woodland assessments from the England Woodland Group. They'll be quite familiar with that. Others again are quite new as well. So I think it's there's the training in actually kind of doing the kind of ground truth thing to identify your kind of baseline values. So that's familiar with the condition assessments. There's the metric itself as well, and getting familiar with that. So I think sometimes people think that the metric is there to replace ecologists. It's absolutely not. It's a tool to be used in conjunction with ecological judgment. But having training in terms of your ability to understand what the metric does and doesn't do, it does have its limitations. And there are training courses available through professional bodies on that as well. So I think that's another area. And then one of the final areas is around net gains. Really, it's aiming for really long-term kind of ongoing management and maintenance as well. So we're often quite used to thinking in relatively short timeframes in terms of thinking about management plans and the kind of onward management of outcomes. Whereas with net gain, you have to deliver it for at least 30 years. So again, kind of thinking in that longer term, actually what might this site be like in 30 years time? I'll be well retired by then personally. And so it's that kind of slightly different approach to how we think about the kind of factors to consider on sites as well.
Okay, so I mean, in one aspect, it covers virtually everything, right? In terms of our sort of ability to, assess a site. So I know from experience myself then that prior to like undertaking a preliminary ecological appraisal, yes, we're looking at habitats with species, write up a report, but there's this additional elements that I can see now that we're going to have to spend a lot more time even before we're actually going into the field, shall we say, looking at a particular site. Looking at, I suppose, the habitat prior to visiting. So what I mean by that is that a site could be slightly manipulated on site when we arrive, for whatever reason. And I think we need to be looking a little bit more, at the site, what's happened in the past, like 10, 20 years. Is that something that the metric looks at?
Yeah, so one of the things that is in the Environment Act, which I think is really quite helpful, is that we're all familiar with instances where people have either deliberately or unintentionally kind of degraded a site, sort of before they're looking to then sort of do assessments in terms of its ecological value. Helpfully, the Environment Act actually sets a date that says that, if you can't agree what the kind of baseline date or period for a site should be, the date is the 30th of January 2020, and it's the day that the bill was reintroduced into Parliament. So it's then thinking, okay, so what was the kind of development? What was the kind of the value of the site before any of the development works had commenced? So you don't have to go back, massively far in time. It's a snapshot in terms of baseline. You don't have to kind of identify a kind of trend in terms of was this site kind of improving or declining. But as you said, you often won't necessarily have access to the site. So it's then being able to make best use of other kind of sources of information, aerial photography, national data sets, but also being quite precautionary about how you approach things. Because one of the things I'm finding really positive as an outcome from Biodiversity Net Gain already, and this is bearing in mind that the mandatory approach isn't yet law, is the fact that all too often in the past, schemes will be quite far advanced in terms of their kind of level of design, etc., until the ecologist gets to see them, and then suddenly you're like, oh, try and make this green, and you've got such a limited opportunity then to do anything with it. Whereas I think what Net Gain is starting to drive people to do, and I would encourage listeners on this as well, is to say the earlier you can be thinking about this and the more holistically people can be engaging on Net Gain, the easier you'll find it to deliver. So at site selection stage, what's going to be the site, if you've got choices around this, it's got the lowest baseline, so you're not impacting on sites that have already got some good quality nature. And also, how can you engage best with landscape architects, civil engineers, other professionals in terms of nature being a kind of solution to the design of that site as well, rather than it coming in at the very end. So encouraging people to think about Net Gain and using the metric at site selection, outline design stages, and then when you've got access to the site, then you can kind of do some more kind of detailed ground truthing. But if you've been precautionary from the outset, hopefully at that point when you do get to the site, there aren't any surprises that suddenly you weren't expecting there as well.
I can see that. You mentioned there about additional sort of professionals. So maybe architects, landscape architects, obviously the client themselves.
Yeah.
So in terms of engagement at the earliest opportunity, I think that's one of the key requisites, isn't it? Trying to get involved. Surely it must be advantageous to the developer or the landowner to seek out those services at an early stage, because I'm sure from an economic point of view, it may help them further down that line.
You'd think so, and in many cases it is, but you'd still be surprised by the number of developers who suddenly discover that their scheme, which they were all set to kind of launch on, kind of commence, they've only now discovered that there's Great Christian Newts, for example, on the scheme, and then the whole thing's got held up. Whereas if they'd kind of done some just early engagement around that and done some early surveys, that would have been identified much earlier on. So I do think there has been a legacy of, not quite, but almost treating the environment as an afterthought in the development process. It's like, we've got to focus on the making sure some of the kind of heavy engineering can all work. And then how can the actual kind of, where does green come into all of this? And if net gain achieves nothing else other than to get the environment being factored into people's thinking much earlier on, that's a great outcome as far as I'm concerned, because it should hopefully deliver kind of better quality schemes, but also it kind of just raises the profile as well within organisations that actually environmental matters, nature is something that needs to be considered and factored in for good reasons.
Yeah, and I can see that I think I mentioned before about we're very good at talking to other ecologists, for instance, about ecological issues, but there seems to be also now maybe even a greater requirement. I mean, the requirement was there before, but a greater requirement maybe to, as I say, discuss these plans with a wider set of professionals, but occasionally we may of course approach architects and talk with landscape architects about a particular project, but it's very more standoffish, and unless you're actually working within a practice that has those in-house skills, the likelihood of us actually interacting with those different professionals can be quite limited. But I imagine that once we get involved with what good looks like for Biodiversity Net Gain, these are some of the, I suppose we're going to have to liaise a lot more and communicate with these people, well, not daily, but on a more frequent basis.
No, I agree, and I think one area that potentially the metric can help in all of this as well. So the metric kind of takes information that you're telling it in terms of different types of habitats, and is translating everything into a language of units, biodiversity units. And these are sectors that love to measure things. So it's a world of numbers, and be it around carbon or be it around kind of water usage or kind of whatever. And so I'm not an ecologist, for example, but it's helpful to be able to have information presented to you in a format that if you're not from that particular sector, be it ecology or whatever the sector happens to be, if you can understand what someone's trying to communicate with you. And I think it can help with that. So it's a communication tool. It's got numbers, percentages, etc. People get that, and they can start then thinking, well, okay, so if you're telling me that if I consider this earlier, then those numbers come down in a kind of a positive way, I can see how that can then translate into potential kind of cost savings and kind of de-risking aspects of the project. So yes, I think it can also help with that dialogue, but also just generally, I think being able to understand the kind of the challenges and the constraints that other professionals are kind of working under as well, and how ecology and the environment can also come in as a kind of a help as a solution. So if a scheme is also trying to deal with issues of surface water flooding, or if there's kind of local requirements and expectations around opportunities to deliver kind of screening or things like that, it's again thinking this doesn't have to be engineered as a solution. There are soft engineering solutions available, which can also count towards net gain.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned previously about the metric is a tool, but it's not a decision making tool in its own right. So I mean, we're not taking away anything from the ecologists. We still need to think, don't we?
Indeed.
I mean, in fact, probably even more so about what the implications. I mean, as you say, it's rightly so. Good data in hopefully means good data out, and that's the analysis part. We need to get better at in interpreting these figures, what it actually means to the client, what it actually means to the environment itself. So, in terms of, I suppose, looking at some of the limitations of this tool itself, how do we, first of all, are there any? If so, what are they? And maybe also looking at ways to overcome, override or manipulate, so we say, some of these shortfalls, pitfalls.
So the tool, it's important to understand colleagues who have worked with in Natural England who are working on this will keep repeating that it's not a complex ecological model, and it's not. It deliberately not. Otherwise, you just create a massive black box potentially that no one fully understands. So it doesn't include species-specific data. It is using habitats as a kind of proxy for biodiversity. It doesn't consider indirect impacts either. So it doesn't replace the need to do EIAs if they're needed and things like that. It also, at the moment, and for the kind of, at least the kind of short term, it's on an Excel kind of form as well. It's essentially, it's a very nice spreadsheet, and but it's still a spreadsheet. Ideally, we would like to move it longer term into a kind of digital space as well, where there's lots more scope to do some kind of quite interesting things around it. So it's be aware that it can't do everything, and it's never trying to do everything as well. So Net Gain doesn't replace any existing kind of environmental kind of policies or kind of requirements. So you still need to do your protected species surveys. You still need to kind of meet your other kind of requirements as well. But that being said, it's very good at doing what it does. So it's good as a tool for saying, actually, what was the baseline value of the site, and then being able to predict into the future. And it is evidence-based. So when when numbers are coming out of it saying, well, this is the kind of type of quantum that's needed in order to achieve a net gain, it's already been factoring in questions around, on a habitat by habitat basis, well, how difficult is this particular habitat to deliver? And obviously some are much easier than others, or will take a lot longer or less time than others. How many years will it take to reach the kind of time to target condition? So it does have evidence underpinning it as well, although inevitably that's having to take an average. So this is a tool that's going to be used across England by a whole range of different development types as well. So there will undoubtedly be instances where you've got a project that says, actually, I think I can do this quicker than necessarily the tool suggests. And the tool has always acknowledged that and said, well, if you think that's the case, there is scope to, if the consenting body agrees, to deviate slightly from what the tool is saying. But it's there to say, on an average basis, this is how long you can expect things to take. I think the other great advantage of it, and I think the really, to my mind, significant change that Net Gain is delivering, is for the first time we've got a mechanism that kind of values, for want of a better term, the kind of run-of-the-mill kind of wildlife, the kind of the scrubby habitats, the places that always get ignored, never get valued at all. In any kind of planning context, and they all now have a value. You have to do something positive to those. So I think that's the really fundamental thing, because in most cases, if you were going to planning and if there were no protected species and there are no protected sites involved, unless there was particularly priority habitat, nothing that was on the site had any value. Whereas now, everything, even if you don't touch it, you still got to do something positive to it. So I think that's a really significant change, and I'm hoping it will leave a lasting legacy in terms of actually the kind of greening of developments, but also away from the development sites themselves, if you're offsetting opportunities to enhance the kind of wider countryside and kind of other places as well.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So in terms of, you mentioned about lasting legacies there as well. So in terms of options available to a developer, landowner.
Yep.
Okay, so let's go for developers to start off with. So in terms of, they've assessed their site, they've engaged with an ecologist and other professionals at an early stage. They've got their design sorted, the iterative process of going back and forth. They've got the calculation there. Now, in terms of what are the advantages, of keeping things on site BNG compared to looking off-site and other alternatives?
So there could be advantages in terms of cost. So particularly if you've got other things in terms of green infrastructure that you're looking to try and kind of integrate into the site as well. So it could be that through a combination of a kind of a SUD scheme for the site, some other kind of green infrastructure type features. It all depends on what the baseline value was. Actually, you could have achieved net gain there. And actually in doing so, the costs are comparatively low because you're also at the same time delivering some of the other, or addressing some of the other challenges that the site has as well. Equally, it could be that you think, actually, I'm wanting to, most developers are quite interested in placemaking, and most kind of local authorities are as well. They're wanting to see schemes coming forward that offer kind of real kind of opportunities and benefits to both existing and kind of incoming residents. And one of the things that our collective experience of COVID highlighted was actually, how much we value having, the public values in terms of having contact with the natural environment and the health and well-being benefits that can provide. But that's quite inequitable in terms of, some communities, they've got really well served with it. Others got no, they're living essentially in a kind of concrete desert. So I think, again, there's opportunities on site in terms of your ability to deliver what the developer's objectives, potentially also to deliver what the kind of local planning authority is looking for as well. But there will always be instances where on-site wholly isn't necessarily the answer. It could be that actually just the scheme itself, the design can't accommodate on-site. It could also be that the ecology is best delivered off-site as well, particularly where you've got habitats that are particularly prone to, and species are particularly prone to disturbance, for example, as well, and it might be better served actually aiming to deliver that off-site. And then in terms of how the policy works, the policy is coming at this from a presumption of try and deliver on-site. It doesn't insist you do deliver on-site, but try and deliver on-site. And in part, ecologically, that's a recognition that, well, if everything just goes off-site, over time, you're going to create these kind of ecological deserts in places. And also, a kind of an unwritten element of the policy is, although it's biodiversity net gain, we live on a crowded island, and there's a lot of people, and I think there's a kind of a recognition that actually, if we want people to kind of value the natural environment and value wildlife and be help us in our collective endeavour to try and address the nature emergency, we need people on board as well. And so, being seen to be able to provide people with the kind of green and blue spaces that we know they want as well through various studies on a site or close to a site, again, that's quite beneficial. But it does obviously provide with that mechanism. So actually on site, you don't always have to do it, and then you can start going off site as well.
Okay, and in terms of, I mean, it's one of these concepts. I mean, I've got no personal involvement in this at all, but I'm familiar with on-site, off-site, mitigation, compensation, and biodiversity credits. So this is another, I say, option, I suppose, that could be available to a developer, but probably less favourable compared to the other two, is it?
Yeah, so they're the option of last resort. So we're coming to a position once mandatory net gain commence, where essentially it would be illegal to try and proceed with a development that wasn't delivering net gain. So legally, the developer has to achieve net gain. We've already talked about the fact that although there's a presumption about delivering on-site where possible, that's not always possible, either for practical reasons or good ecological reasons. And so, developers will then be looking for suitable off-site providers. It may well be, though, that local circumstance means actually there's not someone with the appropriate sites available to that developer. So the developer then would have a problem because legally they have to achieve net gain, but they've got no mechanism for doing so. So that's when statutory credits is designed to come in. So the expectation is that they might be in greater demand in the early days as whilst the market kind of ratchets up, if you like, in terms of the suitable availability of supply. Developers would have to demonstrate that they're not able to do it on site. They had tried to find someone off site and were unable to before they could go to credits. They'd also be priced at a point that tried to make them uncompetitive with the kind of wider market. But when if you can satisfy those tests, the developer would then be able to purchase credits from governments, and they'd be invested in kind of strategic landscape scale kind of schemes somewhere else in the country. So there'd be no guarantee they're being invested locally, but they would be sort of invested somewhere. So we think they're needed, but we also think that it's right to have the emphasis on the market and on-site rather than credits as well. So they're there as an option if required, but very much as a last resort.
Yeah. So in terms of, I would say, providing then these units off-site and by an alternative provider, shall we say? So so obviously you're calling for. I imagine that government is calling forward sites to be not allocated, but put forward for maybe offsetting biodiversity using this scheme itself. Now, I know there has been criticism edged at okay, well, a developer can just say, well, I'm going to trash my site, and then I know I'm going to be able to get things off site. But it clearly is going to be an economic impact upon I suppose, the viability of a scheme itself. Now, in terms of, I suppose, the availability of these sites, how well set up are we currently, do you think, to actually meet a demand when it becomes mandatory in, hopefully next year?
So there's definitely a growing interest and growing awareness that this is an opportunity coming. So government estimates that the size of the market in providing kind of offsite units, depending on what sort of type of assumptions you make about what percentage gets delivered offsite, could be somewhere in the region of between 130 to 180 million pounds a year. So it's not an insubstantial market. We're seeing growing interest from a kind of range of landowners in this as an opportunity. So from farmers looking to kind of diversify income or to kind of use bits of land that are kind of not particularly viable from a kind of agricultural production perspective. We're also seeing interest from local authorities where they've got their own land holdings in kind of parks and green spaces where they think there could be an opportunity here to improve the biodiversity of some of those sites, but obviously doing so in a way that doesn't compromise the fact that they're actually amenity spaces as well. So you need to be quite sensitive to how you go about it. And developers themselves. So we've got organisations, some with quite significant land holdings, who have got what up until quite recently they've just regarded as stranded assets. So they've got land somewhere that's got no particular development value. They can't. It's on their books, but they can't really find an economic kind of a benefit from it. Who sort of turning towards net gain, think, well, actually potentially this is an opportunity to get an income from this land. And we do think the kind of the money that the landowners will get will be quite competitive compared to other potential sources of income. I mean, it will be a market. It's a regulated, it's a regulated market in a sense, but it's down to whatever the individual landowner can negotiate price wise. But looking at what people have been charging to date and government's analysis, there are some potentially quite attractive returns if you're a landowner that you could get through net gain. And the bit that I found really fascinating is that, so I've worked at Natural England for the best part of, I think, about 15 years or something like that. Up until this year, I've never been phoned by financial institutions wanting to find out about, what am I doing work-wise or what Natural England's doing work-wise. There's now significant interest from kind of institutional investors and kind of asset managers and some of the big kind of financial players in investing in the natural environment because they themselves can see this as a potential opportunity. So it's private money, private sector money going into the environment. And if that's delivering a positive outcome for nature, then I think that's that hopefully that should be a good thing as well. So so we don't know. I mean, it's day one's potentially only kind of just over about a year away. The expectation is this will commence November next year. There are growing numbers of organisations and landowners kind of starting to work on this. This government money was made available through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Funds to try and help kind of pump prime certain projects as well. So, but I think there will be a need still for credits on day one, but as the market kind of begins to develop further, the expectation is that credit demand dissipates as the market picks up the demand.
Yeah, and I suppose that, I mean, obviously from a landowner's point of view, it is about obviously the cost.
Yep.
So their return of investment should be, because obviously there may be a financial benefit for biodiversity net gain, but there's also a loss of the agricultural use there as well. So I think obviously they're going to have to balance that out. And I mean, we've just recently attended the Farm Business Innovation Show up in Birmingham, the NEC, and I think a large percentage of the conversations we were having, well, it was a mixture of conversations, but it's certainly a lot about, okay, landowners. They're aware of this. It's something on their radar. Estate managers are also talking to their clients about these opportunities. It's still early days. I think no one knows fully sure whether they're going to be going for this or not. But they're interested. I think it's a really good. As you say, it can help deliver that win-win situation for both, developers and landowners, and of course, more importantly for us, biodiversity or the environment.
No, indeed. And there are other bits of information people are still waiting on as well. So there are still areas of uncertainty. So one of the questions that regularly comes up to us from landowners is, well, okay, I've got this net gain for biodiversity, but then we've also got things like nutrient neutrality, carbon kind of markets, future environmental land management schemes. How do these all interact together? Can I sell carbon credits at the same time as biodiversity units, for example, and things like that. So there is a need for more information and greater kind of guidance, particularly on questions that get described as kind of stacking and bundling, so the ability to combine different schemes. We're expecting more information to be coming out from government quite soon on that. So I think that will be quite helpful as well from a kind of financial planning perspective for some landowners. There are other issues that are on the minds of some landowners. So questions around taxation. So you get agricultural property relief. What's the situation with biodiversity net gain? And there's discussions ongoing with Treasury and HMRC around that as well. But so I think there's areas where it would be great if there was already greater clarity. There's still information to come, but no, I agree with you. I mean, there's definitely an interest out there as well, and I think landowners are looking at this as to. It's not going to work for everyone. It will depend where they are in the country, potentially in terms of how much local development is taking place, and also kind of making sure they provide the habitats that the developers need as well. Because again, it's a market, and there are rules in terms of you can't just kind of trade down as a developer. You need to be kind of delivering equivalents or trading up, and it very much will depend on what types of habitats are being found within red lines as to the types of habitats developers then consequently need. So it's making sure they're providing the right type of supply, and understanding what the local market for that provision might be as well.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of that value, then that's going to. I think probably we decided that obviously the market decides really where each unit. I mean, obviously there's not going to be a set price for a particular biodiversity unit, is there?
No, there's no set price. There are things that do kind of nudge delivery into particular areas or particular types of outcome. So one of the things the metric does is it provides a reward in terms of the multiplier. If you're delivering something in advance, so we're keen to encourage landowners to start changing their kind of investing now as well, partly because we are in a nature crisis, so we don't want to be waiting another 15 or so years before habitats coming on stream. But the earlier you create or start investing in habitats, then that will mean that at the point you come to sell, actually your land can generate more units than if you just started at that moment in time. So that's one thing. The other thing is through the ability of local environmental kind of strategies to influence what and where things get delivered as well. So again, the metric has this strategic significance multiplier component in it, which is basically there to say, if you're delivering an outcome either in a location or of a habitat type that's been identified locally as being important, your land can generate slightly more units than someone else's land that isn't. And over time, it's intended that local nature recovery strategies will be the kind of the kind of national way of identifying this around the country. Obviously, they're still in early days. So in the interim, people are using green infrastructure strategies or existing biodiversity strategies. But again, it's just a way of trying to encourage the delivery of the kind of right habitats in the right place, if that makes sense as well.
No, it does. And I think, as I say, there's great opportunities there to be had. And in terms of as an example of that, then it could be that say a landowner wants to put part of their land in, up for, register it with whoever they're going to register with. I don't know where you'd register, but
I'll come on to that.
Okay, good. And so say they're going to be, for very simple example, planting some trees on their land. And now, obviously, that takes, if they've got those trees on their land for about 5 years, and someone approaches them after 5 years, that's going to be more economically appealing to the landowner than if they were planting them on day one. Is that correct?
Potentially, yes. So they'll find that those trees will have a slightly higher unit per hectare value than they would if they planted them on day one. Obviously, there's other things to consider. So they may find on day one, because this is a new market, and so depending on how many suppliers are in that market, they may find prices are slightly higher in day one than they are in 5 years. So there's that to factor in. But no, essentially that's how that works, and it can have quite a significant impact on some habitats as well. So some you can find essentially the kind of unit per hectare that can be generated can almost double within kind of a period of time of kind of less than 5 years as well. And it's basically because the risk factors associated with that habitat have dropped away. The habitat is in situ. It's improving. It may be quite close, depending on what it is, to already achieving its time to target conditions. So those risk elements of the metric don't need to be applied. So it gives it kind of gives it a high value. On the register, I'm glad you mentioned that. So under the mandatory scheme, when that commences, any landowner that's looking to participate in this market will need to register the land on a national register. So that's currently in the process of being built. It's due to come on stream next summer. So it'll be a digital platform that anyone, you or I, can access and kind of interrogate. And a developer can only, or planning authority rather, can only consent to development if the developer, when they're going off-site, can actually demonstrate that they've got a landowner and land that's been allocated to that development on the register as well. So that registration process will be quite important for landowners. And it's there to also provide a means of providing some transparency into the system as well. So to make sure that you don't have a situation where a landowner with a hectare of field plants your trees on, for example, sells that to one developer, says, thank you very much, then turns to another developer and says, I've got a hectare, I'll sell that to you as well, and I'll sell that to you as well. And it's all on the same hectare. So it's to make sure you don't get that kind of, those type of activities taking place. But then also to allow for you or I to be able to see that if a development is taking place locally and they can't fully do it on site, and they're saying, well, I'm achieving net gain, well, you'll be able to see, well, how are they and where are they achieving net gain as well? So and I think that's helpful, because I think otherwise it's quite easy to just be quite cynical and say, well, yeah, of course you're going to say you're doing something good, but where's they don't ever see any evidence of that. At least now you'll have access to a kind of a register, and you'll be able to see, where is this being delivered, what type of outcome is being delivered, and what planning permission is it linked back to as well. So the register will be quite an important function. It's also important from a monitoring perspective, because it provides then data back to Natural England and ultimately to government, because we will be running a kind of long-term monitoring program around net gain. We're assuming various things about it, create the habitats, the species will come, being a big assumption, for example. So there's various things that we're going to be monitoring and evaluating. And the register plays an important role in that as well, in terms of the data it can provide us with, so that we can then say to government, actually, do you know what? something needs slightly tweaking here because it's not quite working in this regard.
Oh, well, you beat me to it there. I was going to come on straight onto that monitoring part
right.
there. So
Yep.
where would that actually sit? So okay, so it sort of sits on the same registry platform then.
Yeah, so there's two elements to it. So there's monitoring that goes back to the consenting bodies. So these are at least 30-year agreements. So what we don't want to do is to only discover at year 30 that actually, Joe Bloggs never did anything, having had the money, and nothing ever happened on that parcel of land, or that everything has gone horribly wrong and no kind of interventions have happened. So there will be a requirement for landowners to report back either to the planning authority if they're secured through kind of Section 106 type agreements, or through to the responsible bodies if if the legal mechanism that's securing the land is a conservation covenant. And one of the things Natur England's currently testing is kind of standardized templates for that as well, so that you've got some consistency of data going back. You haven't got back of fag packet things going through, for example. So that's something we're currently testing. And so the reporting going back to the planning authorities and the responsible bodies, they can take enforcement action if needed as well. But also the information should be going to the register as well, so that just to kind of so that you can access the reports to see actually, yes, this is how this particular site is progressing.
Okay, so you mentioned both, Section 106 agreements there and conservation covenants. In terms of, I suppose, consistency of approach. Then, so
yep.
If say 50% of agreements are under a Section 106, 50% are under a conservation covenant, is there any likelihood of say any enforcement issues and any enforcement challenges to either the landowner or the developer? I mean, imagine the developer sort of goes, I paid my money, I'm walking away,
yes,
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yep.
But in terms of the obligations on the landowner who has to deliver this benefit, what are the? I mean, you may not be placed. I'm sorry to answer this question, but in terms of the difference between a Section 106 and a conservation covenant, is one preferable over another? I know one's for a local authority to deal with, and the other's private. But is that the main difference?
Yeah, so I would encourage any landowner, obviously, to seek legal advice themselves as well in terms of what's going to be the best for you. I mean, one key difference between the two is that so mandatory net gain requires you to deliver net gains over a minimum of 30 years. There are landowners out there who are very happy and in fact quite keen to deliver for a much longer period of time as well, and some potentially out to in perpetuity. And conservation covenants provide a legal mechanism to potentially enable rather people to do that if they're so willing. So that would be kind of one example. So it could be that if you're a landowner who is already quite vested in nature and conservation, you could be an NGO and for example, then it might be that conservation covenants are actually the thing you're looking that are more appropriate for you. Equally, if you're a habitat bank and you're looking to potentially set up and then sell possibly a quite large area to different landowners, in terms of, different developers. So developer X needs 10 units, developer Y needs 30, and you're kind of parceling your site up. It may be that actually, again, having that whole site into a conservation covenant might be an easier mechanism for you than a series of individual 106 agreements. But it will come down to decisions by landowners as to what they feel is most suitable and most appropriate to them, I think. So
yeah, no, exactly. Seek legal advice. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah. And you've been very generous with your time, Nick. Thank you for that. And I think we're just coming towards this sort of close, and just one further major question I'd like to ask you, and that's regarding, I suppose, the long-term monitoring. So these long-term management plans. Say like at least 30 years, and some happy to engage with longer terms. And I suppose it brings into that those words, was it better, bigger, and more across the whole of England itself. Now, what considerations in terms of, I suppose, in one way, the development of these plans, is there a template for a long-term biodiversity offsetting management plan, for instance? If so, where can I get hold of one? But realistically, is there a sort of set standard for that we need to be using, such as I think it's the BS, was it 8683, something like that?
Yep.
And in terms of where these documents will be held, I mean, will that be on that register as well?
So there is a template being tested. I'll have to try and say this slowly because I always trip up over it. So Natural England is also testing a habitat management and monitoring plan template, HMMP, as it gets kind of coined. So that's out with a series of organisations and individuals now who are kind of testing that and will be providing us with feedback in February time. So if others are interested, if there's a way for them to get in touch with myself, I can pass them on to colleagues in Natural England who are working on that. So the ambition is to provide this kind of template so that you have got this consistency, and it kind of sets out how to think in terms of that much longer time period than perhaps people are kind of more used to doing. And we are encouraging the development of standards. So you mentioned one, so the kind of British standard. It's not a requirement of Net Gain, but it came out last year. I think it's quite a useful standard. It's a process standard, so it's the things to be considering in terms of the design and implementation of Net Gain, both in terms of on-site, in terms of the development site itself, but also for landowners who are delivering off-site as well. The kind of process that to encourage and for them to have in place. And it draws heavily from the best practice principles that were established by bodies like SIEM and IEMA and Syria as well. So it's a good standard. But others are also working on the idea of kind of standards for offsets, for example, and things like that. So again, it's kind of watch this space, I think, potentially as some of those might emerge. Future Parks Accelerator is considering a kind of standard for kind of public spaces, so parks and green spaces who are providing offsets, for example. And it's one that, as Natural England, we're quite keen to see and encourage things that will help drive up the quality of delivery. None of us are interested in substandard, poor quality outcomes, and I think that applies to developers for the most part as well. They want to know that their money is going to something half decent as well. So there's an interest in that, and it's an area we're keen to sort of see other kind of complementary standards start to come through as well. And you'll have to say what your last question was. I completely forgot to write it down.
No. That's always that links on to. So in terms of, I've got two quick questions.
Yep.
Really. Hopefully they're quick questions for you. So first of all, is there? Obviously this applies to England, and yes. I know you obviously with Natural England don't represent any other part of the any other devolved governments, but is there appetite elsewhere across the UK for such a scheme as this then?
Yeah, it's an interesting question at this moment in time, actually, because we know the metric is being used outside of England. So there are companies using it in Scotland, companies using it in Wales, and more recent conversations with NatureScot and with Natural Resources Wales have indicated an interest in whether there's scope to develop some sort of UK framework, which I think would be quite helpful, because you're going to always get developments that are on or around the border. And as you said, Net Gain legally applies to England in terms of the coming mandatory approach. So ipso facto, it would be illegal to try and do your delivery in Wales or Scotland. And there may be perfectly sensible reasons locally where actually that's the best place to deliver. So some sort of arrangement, I think, going forward would be helpful. But the environment is a devolved matter, so that's very much for the decision makers in Scotland and Wales to kind of decide upon. It's also, as an approach, gathering kind of wider interest as well. So we've had interest from governments as far away as kind of western states of Canada, Colombia in South America, Norway, France, Italy, etc. So there is a lot of interest out there, but I think it would be great if there was a mechanism in the UK to try and kind of tie and join things up a little bit as well. And I think in principle, there's nothing to prevent it from doing so.
Yeah, because I mean, in terms of, just from our own application, we have an office in Wales, we have an office in England, and we work, as you say, work right on the borders, so it's just a consideration there. And as you say, we do implement some sort of biodiversity net gain calculation across in Wales because it helps us understand the tool, but also it does provide a figure that it's quite hard to dispute, really.
And kind of conversations with colleagues kind of north of the border and also in Wales have been along the lines as well that more, as you said, more and more organisations are starting to use it and apply it, thinking it's quite useful. So it may be something that sort of happens by default anyway, just because you've got growing numbers of developers wanting to use it, so it'll be interesting. Watch this space. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Rightio. And I suppose my final question really is now Biodiversity Net Gain in terms of it. I think this is correct. It will also apply to nationally significant infrastructure projects, but it's not currently in marine developments. So is there any? What's the development? What's the latest on terms of marine net gain?
So firstly, on nationally significant infrastructure projects, you're correct. There's a slightly different timetable for the introduction of mandatory net gain for them. So whereas it's expected to be November 2023 for Town and Country Planning Act developments, for developments under the 2008 Planning Act, which is your NSIPs, it's by the end of 2025. Although, to be fair, what we're seeing is a lot of NSIP promoters already coming forward, having factored net gain into their thinking as well. So I think many are seeing this as something to come through. In terms of marine, I think this is going to be quite interesting. So there was a consultation just closed in the summer. So at the moment, net gain doesn't apply beyond the subtidal mark, the mean low water mark. So and so it includes intertidal habitats, but nothing else. And there's interest from industry and from kind of government and other agencies in developing an approach to marine net gain. It's very early days. So there was this consultation over the summer. They're still at the point of should it have a metric or should it not have a metric? Should it be focused on biodiversity, and if so, what? Or does it just habitats or species, or should it be more ecosystem service driven? It will be interesting to see how it evolves. Speaking very personally, I think there will be a need, whatever happens, for a marine approach and a terrestrial approach to somehow nest together, because there are developments, offshore wind, for example, where the actual kind of the wind farm is in the middle of the sea, but all their cabling needs to come on land, and you need a system that is sensible and can join up as well. So I'll be interested to see how that one develops.
Okay, and for we're going to be using obviously UK HAB, isn't it? For intertidal, is it UNIS?
Yes, UNIS is the classification system that has kind of driven the intertidal habitats within the metric. So.
Well, I tell you what, it's been fascinating. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I mean, there's a whole heap of other things that I've got in front of me, but I'm not going to talk about. Local nature recovery strategies and so forth. But we'll leave that for another time. But is there anything, in terms of some quick top tips for anyone, particularly ecologists out there who want to get to know more information about Biodiversity Net Gain, the metric itself, and understand the whole process? Where would you signpost people to?
So I definitely try and do the same training or equivalent training on the metric. I think that'd be really helpful if you haven't done that. The information about net gain is a little bit scattered, and that's partly just a consequence of challenges and getting information into a single place in government. So we tend to use the Planning Advisory Services website, and it's got a whole section on Biodiversity Net Gain. It's got loads of kind of videos and webinars and links to documents. So do look at that, and do just have, going back to what you were saying right at the start about the opportunity to kind of do this early and start thinking about it early. So I would encourage everyone who's listening to, if you're going to be or considering doing net gain on a project, have those conversations as early as possible as well, because you will find it much easier to deliver.
Great, thank you. And we didn't even talk about local authorities. God bless them. I mean, they're going to be. Well, I think obviously a lot of this is going to go to local authorities, and I think they do need our support as well. So I think they'll be learning a lot, alongside us, really.
Absolutely.
Great. But for now, Dr. Nick White, thank you so much for joining me on the Ecology Academy podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
If you enjoy our show and want to help, then please click on the subscribe button and rate us on your favourite podcast player, as that's how you can inspire ecologists in the making, help retain great talent, and provide insights of our industry to a much wider audience of why ecology really does matter. Thank you.